October 14th, 1942. The jagged granite peaks of the Caucasus Mountains are rushing up to meet the belly of a descending Messerschmitt Bf 109. Inside the cramped cockpit, the air reeks of high-octane fuel and panic. The pilot is screaming over the radio. He believes he is surrounded, but the sky above him is empty. In his terror, he has cut off his own flight leader, fled from a phantom enemy, burned through every drop of fuel, and is now belly landing a 30,000 Reichsmark machine onto a dusty frontline road. Dust plumes into the air as the propeller strikes the earth, bending the blades into useless metal pretzels. The canopy slides back. The boy who climbs out is shaking. He is 19 years old, looks 14, and has just humiliated himself in front of the most elite fighter unit on the Eastern Front. By all military logic, this pilot should be washed out of the Luftwaffe or dead within the week. Instead, he walks away from the wreckage to begin a career that will defy the laws of probability, eventually claiming more aerial victories than any other human being in history. To understand the anomaly of this 19-year-old's survival, one must first understand the graveyard he was stepping into. By the autumn of 1942, the air war over the Eastern Front had fundamentally shifted from a turkey shoot into a war of attrition that the German Luftwaffe could not mathematically win. For the first year of Operation Barbarossa, German pilots had enjoyed a period of near total dominance. They had decimated the Soviet Air Force on the ground in the opening weeks of 1941, destroying thousands of obsolete Polikarpov biplanes and early monoplanes. The German Experten, the veteran aces, had treated the Russian skies like a hunting reserve. They flew superior machines, possessed better radio communications, and utilized flexible finger-four formations that allowed them to dictate the terms of every engagement. But as the snows of 1942 began to harden the mud of the steppes, that golden age was violently concluding. The war had descended into the southern sector of the Soviet Union. The German Sixth Army was slowly bleeding to death in the ruins of Stalingrad, a city that had become a magnetic anomaly, drawing in resources and lives from every corner of the Reich. To the south, in the Caucasus, Army Group A was stretching its supply lines to the breaking point, trying to seize the oil fields of Baku. The airspace over these vast, featureless plains was becoming the most dangerous environment in the history of aerial warfare. The Red Air Force, the VVS, was no longer a disorganized collection of frightened conscripts. Under the ruthless reorganization of the Soviet command, they had learned. They had studied the German tactics that slaughtered them in 1941 and adapted. More importantly, the technology gap was closing. The wooden-framed, underpowered fighters of the early war were being replaced by the Yakovlev Yak-1 and Yak-9, and the Lavochkin La-5. These were rugged, low-altitude dogfighters designed specifically for the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front. They were fast, heavily armed, and crucially, available in numbers that the German industry could not hope to match. For every German Messerschmitt that went down, the factories in the Urals were churning out 10 Soviet replacements. For the Luftwaffe, this created a deadly pressure cooker. The veteran pilots, men who had been flying combat non-stop since the invasion of Poland in 1939, were physically and mentally exhausted. They were flying up to 5 or 6 combat sorties a day, every day. They were shot up, crash-landed, patched up, and sent back into the air within hours. But the situation was far worse for the Nachwuchs, the new growth, the rookies. In 1942, a fresh German pilot arriving on the Eastern Front faced a statistical cliff. The training programs in Germany were being shortened to rush bodies to the front. Young men were arriving with barely enough flight hours to handle their high-performance aircraft in calm weather, let alone in a swirling melee against aggressive Soviet Guards regiments. The learning curve was vertical. A rookie had to master complex engine management, navigation over featureless terrain where every village looked the same, and the terrifying physics of deflection, shooting, all while being hunted by enemies who smelled fresh blood. The attrition rate for these newcomers was catastrophic. Many were shot down on their first or second mission, often by enemies they never even saw. They were essentially fodder, bought time for the veterans to do the real work. The prevailing wisdom among the squadron commanders was grim but practical. Ignore the new guy until he survives his first 10 missions. If he lives that long, maybe he's worth learning his name. If he doesn't, he's just another vacancy to be filled by the next train from Berlin. This was the meat grinder awaiting any replacement pilot. It was an environment that punished bravery and rewarded paranoia. The traditional concepts of chivalrous dogfighting, the looping, turning, one-on-one duels reminiscent of the First World War, were becoming suicide pacts. To survive against the swarm of Soviet fighters, a pilot needed more than just good hands and good eyes. He needed a mind capable of rejecting the established rules of engagement. He needed to look at the chaos of the air war and see a mathematical solution. Into this deteriorating strategic nightmare, where the average lifespan of a replacement was measured in days, stepped a blonde-haired teenager who looked too young to buy a beer, let alone fly a killing machine. The unit Erich Hartmann reported to was not merely a fighter squadron. It was the most lethal collection of aerial predators ever assembled. Jagdgeschwader 52 operated near the gigantic mountains of the Caucasus, flying out of dusty makeshift airstrips like Soldatskaya. By the end of the war, this single wing would claim over 10,000 aerial victories. But in late 1942, it was a closed society, a warrior caste driven by a hierarchy of performance. At the top were the Experten, men like Dieter Hrabak and Hermann Graf. These pilots walked with the swagger of untouchables, wearing the Knight's Cross at their throats like casual jewelry. They had survived hundreds of missions by adhering to a brutal code of conduct. To them, air combat was not an adventure. It was a profession. They knew the capabilities of their machines down to the last bolt, and they knew the Soviet mind. The atmosphere in the mess tent was thick with cynical humor, and the unspoken knowledge that their luck was a finite resource, depleting with every sunrise. Into this hardened fraternity walked Hartmann. He was immediately distinct, but for all the wrong reasons. While the veterans were gaunt, hollow-eyed, and aged beyond their years by the stress of constant combat, Hartmann looked like a child who had wandered onto the airfield by mistake. He was fresh-faced, blonde, and jovial. The veterans took one look at him and christened him Booby the Kid. It was a nickname that was half affectionate, half dismissive. To the seasoned killers of JG-52, Booby was just another temporary asset. A kaczmarek, a wingman whose sole purpose was to cover the tail of a superior pilot and, if necessary, catch a bullet meant for the leader. Hartmann's early performance did nothing to dispel this dismissal. His first combat sorties were disasters of discipline. On that ignominious day in October, he had committed the cardinal sin of the German fighter arm. He had lost his head. In his eagerness and fear, he had mistaken a distant aircraft for an enemy, accelerated to full power, and left his leader exposed. When he realized his mistake, he panicked, mistaking the leader coming to retrieve him for a pursuing Soviet fighter. He ran his fuel tanks dry, fleeing from his own side. In a lesser unit, such incompetence might have resulted in a transfer to the infantry or a court-martial. But the group commander, Major Hubertus von Bonnen, saw something in the boy's aggressive failure. Instead of banishing him, he grounded him. For days, Hartmann was forced to work alongside the ground crews, the black men in their grease-stained overalls. He learned the Bf-10s, not as a pilot, but as a mechanic. He learned what the engine sounded like when it was strained, how the thin aluminum skin crumpled under stress, and just how vulnerable the pressurized fuel lines were to enemy fire. During this grounding, the tactical reality of the war began to seep into him. He watched the veterans return. He saw that the ones who came back were not necessarily the best aerobatic pilots. The show-offs, the ones who engaged in prolonged, twisting dogfights, Kurvenkampf, were the ones who eventually didn't return. The Soviet pilots were learning to use their numbers. If a German pilot stayed in a turning fight for more than a minute, a second or third Soviet flight would inevitably arrive to pick him off. The romantic era of the dogfight was dead. The Experten were surviving by being efficient, not flashy. Hartmann, stripped of his ego by his early humiliation, became a blank slate. He began to listen to a specific NCO pilot named Paul Rossmann. Rossmann was not the highest scorer, but he had a peculiar trait. He never seemed to get hit. Rossmann taught the boy that the eyes were more important than the hands. He taught him that if you saw the enemy first, you had already won half the battle. Hartmann was realizing that to survive, he couldn't just be a good pilot. He had to become a distinct type of hunter. He had to stop trying to fly, like the heroes in the propaganda reels, and start thinking like an assassin. To survive the cauldron of the Eastern Front, Hartmann first had to master his tool. By 1943, the machine of choice for JG-52 was the Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, the Gustav. To a layman, it was a sleek fighter. To a pilot, it was a claustrophobic powerhouse that sacrificed handling for sheer lethality. The G6 was a departure from the nimble fighters of the early war. It was heavier, burdened by armor plating and bulletproof glass. Its nose was disfigured by two large bulges, the Böll, necessary to house the breeches of the heavy 13mm machine guns. On the ground, it was a treacherous beast. The narrow landing gear made it prone to ground loops that could snap a wing in seconds. In the air, however, it was an elevator to the stratosphere. The Daimler-Benz 605 engine pushed out nearly 1,500 horsepower, allowing it to climb away from almost anything the Soviets could put in the sky. But the machine was only as good as the pilot's situational awareness, and here the design fought against him. The cockpit was incredibly tight, framed by heavy metal bars that obstructed vision. Behind the pilot's head was a thick steel plate for armor. It protected him from bullets, but it also created a massive blind spot at his 6 o'clock, the exact angle from which death usually approached. To fly the Gustav and live, Hartmann had to be constantly twisting in his harness, scanning every sector of the sky, fighting the physical limitations of the aircraft itself. He was not just fighting gravity. He was fighting a rapidly evolving enemy. The propaganda reels back in Berlin still portrayed the Soviet aviator as an unskilled peasant in a wooden crate. The reality at 15,000 feet was terrifyingly different. The Soviet Guards regiments, the elite units distinguished by the GVIA designation, were now flying American-built P-39 Airacobras supplied through Lend-Lease. The Airacobra was a dangerous anomaly, Rejected by the Western Allies for its poor high-altitude performance, it found its perfect home in the low-altitude brawls of the Eastern Front. It carried a massive 37mm cannon in the nose, a weapon so powerful that a single hit could disintegrate a Messerschmitt. The pilots flying them were veterans who had survived the purge of 1941. They utilized radio coordination, ground control radar, and pendulum tactics, constantly sweeping altitudes to trap unwary Germans. Hartmann realized early that engaging these aircraft in a turning fight was suicide. The Airacobra had a tighter turn radius and better low-speed handling. If he played their game, he would die. To bridge the gap between his rookie incompetence and the lethal reality of the Gustav and the Guards, Hartmann needed a teacher. He found one in Walter Krupinski. If Hartmann was the cautious observer, Krupinski was the embodiment of aggressive chaos. Nicknamed Count Punski for his Prussian affectations, Krupinski flew with a reckless abandonment that terrified his own wingmen. He was a brawler. His aircraft was constantly riddled with holes because he refused to break off an attack until he was practically scraping paint with the enemy. Krupinski took Booby as his wingman and forced him into the fire. The lessons were visceral. Krupinski would dive into a swarm of enemy fighters, shouting commands over the radio, forcing Hartmann to stay glued to his wing through high G turns and vertical climbs. "Get in close, Booby," was the constant refrain. "You can't hit anything from back there." Under Krupinski's wing, Hartmann learned the difference between flying and fighting. He watched how Krupinski managed his energy, trading altitude for speed, striking and then zooming back up before the enemy could react. But while he mimicked Krupinski's aggression, Hartmann's analytical mind began to reject the older pilot's recklessness. Krupinski returned with damaged planes. Hartmann wanted to return with a pristine one. He began to synthesize Krupinski's "get close" mantra with Rossmann's "see first" philosophy. He was quietly assembling the components of a new tactical doctrine, one that would prioritize survival above glory, and in doing so, achieve both. From the synthesis of Rossmann's caution and Krupinski's aggression, Erich Hartmann forged a new doctrine. It was a rejection of the romanticized past in favor of a cold industrial efficiency. He realized that the era of the dogfight, the Kurvenkampf, was a trap. Turning with a Yak or LA-5 bled energy, speed, and situational awareness. It made the hunter a stationary target for every other enemy in the sky. To survive against superior numbers, Hartmann decided he would never dogfight again. Instead, he would ambush. He codified this into a 4-stage algorithm that became his religion. C. Decide, attack, break. The first phase, C, was the most critical. Hartmann trained his vision to a supernatural acuity. While other pilots scanned the horizon in general sweeps, Hartmann focused on spotting the minute glint of sunlight on a canopy or the faint exhaust smudge against the dark earth. He often spotted Soviet formations minutes before his wingman, allowing him to position himself high above and behind the enemy, hidden in the blinding glare of the sun. He became a stalker, shadowing enemy squadrons for 20 or 30 minutes, waiting for the perfect moment when a straggler drifted out of formation or the group relaxed their vigilance. Decide was the moment of calculation. If the tactical situation wasn't perfect, he would not attack. This was revolutionary restraint. Most rookies, fueled by adrenaline, would dive on the first red star they saw. Hartmann would simply wait. If the enemy turned toward him, or if the flak was too heavy, he would abort. He treated combat not as a test of bravery, but as a transaction of risk. If the profit wasn't guaranteed, he wouldn't invest. When he did commit, the attack was terrifying in its swiftness. He utilized the Bf 109's superior dive speed to drop like a stone upon his victim. But unlike other pilots who opened fire at 300 or 400 meters, praying for a lucky hit, Hartmann held his fire. He waited. The enemy aircraft would expand in his windscreen, growing from a speck to a silhouette, to a massive detailed machine. 300 meters, 200, 100. At this range, the enemy filled the entire view. The turbulence from the target's prop wash would rattle Hartmann's cockpit. It required nerves of absolute ice to careen toward a bomber at 700 kilometers per hour without squeezing the trigger. But Hartmann waited until the target was literally unavoidable, often firing from less than 20 meters away. At this point-blank range, he couldn't miss. A short 1-second burst of his cannons would rip the enemy wing off or shatter the engine block. He wasn't damaging the enemy. He was executing them. Immediately following the kill came the break. This was the discipline that kept him alive. He did not stick around to watch the enemy crash. He did not turn to engage the wingman. He pulled the stick back and used his massive speed to rocket back up into the safety of the altitude, untouchable by the slower Soviet fighters trying to scramble after him. He vanished as quickly as he appeared, resetting the equation to 0, ready to stalk again. This method required a specific psychological architecture. Hartmann was not fighting with hate. He was fighting with detached precision. He viewed the enemy aircraft simply as a mechanical problem to be solved. Yet this intimacy with destruction took a toll. To kill from 20 meters meant flying through the debris of the victim. Hartmann's plane was constantly blackened by the oil and soot of the planes he destroyed. On several occasions, he returned to base with pieces of Soviet aluminum embedded in his own radiator, or his windshield obscured by the fluids of the aircraft he had just disintegrated. It was a gruesome, high-risk intimacy. The debris from his victims forced him to crash land 14 times, but he was never shot down by an enemy fighter in the traditional sense. He was the ghost in the machine, the invisible killer who struck from the sun and vanished before the sound of his cannons had even faded. By mid-1943, this boy, who had once fled in terror from a phantom, had become the most efficient predator on the Eastern Front. And the Soviets were beginning to notice. By the summer of 1943, the slow-motion collapse of the German front lines accelerated into a violent spasm. On July 5th, the Wehrmacht launched Operation Citadel, the Battle of Kursk. It was the largest tank engagement in human history, a collision of steel so massive that the dust clouds turned day into twilight across hundreds of miles of the Russian steppe. For the pilots of JG-52, the sky above Kursk was a target-rich hell. The Luftwaffe had concentrated nearly 2,000 aircraft to support the offensive, but the Soviets had massed nearly 3,000. The air war dissolved into a chaotic, rolling furball that stretched from the grass tops to the stratosphere. In this frenzy, Erich Hartmann stopped being a student and became a phenomenon. He had painted a distinctive design on the nose of his Bf 109, a series of jagged black petals radiating out from the spinner. It looked like a thorny mechanical flower opening up to consume the air. The design was meant to be a mark of personal pride, but to the Soviet pilots, it became a mark of death. Soviet intelligence had identified the pilot of the Black Tulip. They knew his call sign, Karaya 1. They named him the Cherny Chort, the Black Devil. The fear Hartmann inspired became a tactical problem. Soviet ground controllers monitoring the German radio frequencies, would hear his voice and immediately broadcast a panic warning across the entire sector. Achtung! Karaya 1 is in the air. All distinct aircraft return to base. Hartmann would dive on a formation of LA-5s, expecting a fight, only to watch them scatter in every direction. The pilots of the Red Air Force, many of whom were brave men, simply refused to engage the Black Devil. They would dive, turn, or flee, abandoning their missions rather than face the invisible ambush from the sun. A bounty of 10,000 rubles, a fortune for a Soviet citizen, was placed on his head. Paradoxically, this infamy frustrated Hartmann. He was a mathematician of death, and the variables were no longer working. If the enemy ran away, he couldn't shoot them down. His kill rate began to stagnate. In a move that perfectly illustrates his cold pragmatism, Hartmann ordered his mechanic to scrub the black tulip off his nose. He didn't want the glory of being recognized. He wanted the anonymity of the executioner. He painted his aircraft to look like every other standard Bf 109 in the squadron. The ruse worked. The Soviet pilots, thinking the Black Devil had rotated out of the sector, returned to their aggressive tactics. Hartmann, invisible once again, resumed his harvest. During the intense fighting of July and August 1943, he was shooting down aircraft at an industrial pace, sometimes 5, 6, or 7 in a single day. He was operating in a fugue state of exhaustion and adrenaline, landing only to rearm and refuel, his hands shaking so badly he could barely hold a cup of coffee, before launching again into the smoke. But the law of averages is the one enemy that cannot be outmaneuvered. On August 20th, 1943, near the Donets River, the mathematics finally turned against him. Hartmann took off, leading a flight to intercept a massive wave of Soviet Il-2 Sturmovix, the heavily armored ground attack planes known as flying tanks. He spotted them low over the deck, escorted by fighters. True to his doctrine, he positioned himself in the sun, picked a target, and dove. The attack was perfect. He closed to point-blank range and hammered the Sturmovik. The Soviet plane exploded, but the debris cloud was unavoidable. Hartmann's Messerschmitt slammed through the fireball. Shrapnel from the exploding Sturmovik shredded his radiator and smashed into his engine cowling. Smoke instantly filled the cockpit. The engine temperature gauge redlined and then died. He was behind enemy lines, losing altitude, and the ground below was swarming with the very Soviet troops he had been strafing for weeks. Hartmann fights the controls of the dying fighter. The propeller windmills to a halt. The silence is sudden and terrifying, broken only by the rush of wind over the canopy. He spots a flat stretch of step and drops the gear lever, realizing too late that the ground is soft, furrowed earth. He belly lands. The Bf 109 skids violently across the dirt, kicking up a wall of brown dust before coming to a grinding, groaning halt. He is alive. But as he violently jettisons the canopy and scrambles onto the wing, he sees the dust cloud on the horizon. It is not wind, it is a truck. Soviet infantry. They are less than a mile away and closing fast. Hartmann knows he cannot outrun a truck on open ground. He reaches for the signal pistol in his survival pack, briefly considering fighting, but realizes the absurdity of engaging a squad of soldiers with a flare gun. Instead, he makes a split-second decision that requires more discipline than any dogfight. He decides to play the victim. He scrambles back into the cockpit, slumps forward over the stick, and begins to moan. He bites the inside of his lip until he tastes copper, letting the blood trickle down his chin. When the Soviet soldiers arrive, weapons raised, shouting commands, they find a broken, sobbing boy. They drag him roughly from the cockpit. Hartmann goes limp. He feigns internal injuries, crying out in agony every time they touch him. The soldiers, convinced he is dying, do not bother to bind his hands or search him thoroughly. They toss him into the back of their truck like a sack of grain, placing a single guard with a rifle to watch him. The truck rumbles east, deeper into Soviet territory. Hartmann lies motionless, watching the guard through slit eyes. He is calculating. He is waiting for a variable to change. It happens 20 minutes later. The roar of engines fills the sky. A flight of German Ju-87 Stukas appears overhead, diving to bomb the very road the truck is traveling on. The driver panics, swerving off the road into a ditch. The truck slams to a halt. Dust and confusion engulf the vehicle. The guard, terrified by the screaming sirens of the dive bombers, looks up at the sky for a fraction of a second. Break. Hartmann explodes into motion. He kicks the guard in the stomach, knocking the wind out of him, and vaults over the side of the truck. He hits the ground running. Before the driver or the other soldiers can react, he dives into a massive field of sunflowers, plants that grow 7 feet high in the rich Ukrainian soil. The stalks are thick and dense, a jungle of green. He hears shots ringing out behind him, bullets snapping through the stems, but he is already gone, vanishing into the vegetation. He runs until his lungs burn, putting distance between himself and the road, deeper into the endless sea of yellow flowers. He waits for nightfall. The temperature drops rapidly on the steppe. Shivering in his flight suit, Hartmann navigates by the stars, moving west toward the flashes of artillery on the horizon. It is a surreal, lonely trek. He is the deadliest pilot in the world, reduced to a fugitive crawling through the mud. As he nears the German lines, a new danger emerges. A shadowy figure rises from a foxhole ahead. A sentry. Hartmann hears the bolt of a rifle slide home. He freezes. In the darkness, the sentry cannot see his uniform. If he speaks Russian, he dies. If he speaks German, the nervous sentry might shoot anyway. "Don't shoot," Hartmann screams in German. "I am a German pilot." A bullet cracks past his ear. The sentry fires again. Hartmann hits the dirt, screaming his rank and name, cursing the soldier's aim. Finally, the firing stops. A voice calls out, skeptical and terrified. Hartmann crawls forward, hands raised. When he finally stumbles into the trench, the infantrymen look at him like he is a ghost. His flight suit is torn, his face is smeared with dried blood and mud, and his eyes are wild. He is given a rifle and told to wait. The infantry unit is under attack. Hartmann, the ace of the skies, spends the rest of the night fighting as a common foot soldier, firing into the darkness at the rushing shapes of Soviet infantry. By the time he is finally identified and driven back to JG-52 the next morning, he has changed. The boyishness is gone. The booby nickname remains, but the irony has vanished. He has seen the war from the ground, seen the faces of the men trying to kill him. He climbs back into a cockpit that same afternoon. He does not take leave. He does not ask for rest. He simply hunts with a renewed, terrifying focus. The escape from the sunflower field marked the end of Erich Hartmann as a mere soldier, and the beginning of his existence as a living myth. He returned to the air with a grim fatalism. The war had turned irrevocably against Germany. The Wehrmacht was retreating across the very steppes they had conquered, and JG-52 was forced to hop from airfield to airfield, burning their own supplies before the Red Army could seize them. Yet, as the German position collapsed, Hartmann's personal tally skyrocketed. The sky was saturated with targets. The Soviets, sensing victory, were throwing aircraft into battle with reckless abandon. Hartmann, now fully matured in his see, decide, attack, break doctrine, was harvesting them. He crossed the 200 victory mark in March 1944. By August, he had reached 300, a number that seemed mathematically impossible to the Allied command. He was summoned to the Wolf's Lair to receive the diamonds to the Knight's Cross from Adolf Hitler himself. Even in the presence of the dictator, Hartmann displayed the same cold nerve he used in the cockpit. When told he must surrender his sidearm before entering the bunker, Hartmann refused, stating that if the Führer did not trust his frontline officers, he did not want the medal. He was allowed to enter armed. He found a trembling, broken man moving imaginary armies on a map, a stark contrast to the precise, reality-based war Hartmann was fighting in the air. By late 1944, the threat had evolved again. Over the oil fields of Romania, Hartmann encountered a new enemy, the United States Army Air Forces. The P-51 Mustangs were faster, better armed, and flown by pilots who were well-trained and rested. In his few engagements with the Americans, Hartmann proved his tactics were universal. He shot down 5 Mustangs, not by dogfighting them, but by ambushing them. He ran them out of fuel, trapped them, and executed them. But these victories were hollow. The Luftwaffe was ceasing to exist as a cohesive force. Fuel was so scarce that cows were used to tow the Messerschmitts to the runway to save taxing gas. On May 8, 1945, the final day of the war in Europe, Erich Hartmann took off for the last time. He was over Brno, Czechoslovakia. He spotted a Soviet Yak-9 performing victory rolls above the city, celebrating the end of the war. It was a fatal error of arrogance. Hartmann dove, fired, and the Yak exploded. It was victory number 352. He landed his plane as Soviet tanks were breaking through the airfield perimeter. He ordered his ground crew to burn the aircraft, the machine that had kept him alive for 1,400 sorties. With the smoke of his burning fighter rising behind him, Hartmann led his men west, marching toward the lines of the U.S. 90th Infantry Division. He surrendered to the Americans, believing he would be treated as a prisoner of war under the Geneva Convention. He was wrong. Under the secret terms of the Yalta Conference, the Allies had agreed to hand over all German troops who had fought on the Eastern Front to the Soviet Union. The Americans disarmed Hartmann and his men, loaded them onto trucks, and drove them back east. The Black Devil was being delivered directly into the hands of the people who had placed a fortune on his head. For the next 10 years, the pilot who had ruled the skies was confined to a concrete cell. The Soviets were determined to break the Black Devil, not just physically, but ideologically. They did not want to execute him. They wanted to convert him. The newly formed East German government needed legitimacy, and having the world's greatest ace lead their new air force would be a propaganda coup. They subjected Hartmann to a relentless psychological assault. He was placed in solitary confinement for total darkness. He was starved. He was interrogated for days without sleep. They drafted false war crimes charges, accusing him of deliberately strafing a bread factory and killing civilians, a fabrication Hartmann laughed at, pointing out that his 13mm machine guns couldn't destroy a brick building even if he wanted to. When threats failed, they tried bribery. They offered him freedom, a general's rank in the East German Air Force, and a comfortable life for his family. Hartmann's response was absolute. He looked his captors in the eye and told them, "If you want me to work for you, you will have to kill me. I will not paint a red star on my wing. He became a nightmare for the camp administrators. He organized hunger strikes among the German prisoners. He refused to work in the mines. Even in the Gulag, he maintained the same defiant independence that had frustrated his commanders in the Luftwaffe. He was a man who simply refused to acknowledge authority that he did not respect. It took the death of Joseph Stalin and the personal intervention of West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer to finally unlock the cage. In 1955, the last 10,000 prisoners of war were released. Erich Hartmann was put on a train bound for the West. When the train hissed to a halt at the station in Herleshausen, Hartmann stepped onto the platform. He was 33 years old, but his frame was skeletal, and his eyes held the 1,000-yard stare of the camps. Waiting in the crowd was Ursula, the girl he had married during a brief leave in the war, the woman who had waited 10 years for a ghost. He had survived the meat grinder of the Eastern Front and the slow death of the Gulag to keep a promise to return to her. Hartmann eventually joined the newly formed West German Luftwaffe, commanding the 1st All-Jet Squadron, the Richthofen Wing. But the maverick spirit that saved him in 1943 doomed his military career in the Cold War. He publicly criticized the purchase of the American F-104 Starfighter, calling the aircraft a widowmaker due to its instability. The political generals silenced him, but history vindicated him after nearly 300 German F-104s crashed. Forced into early retirement in 1970, the greatest ace in history spent his final years as a civilian flight instructor, teaching young pilots how to fly small Cessnas, finally at peace with the sky. History often tries to paint Erich Hartmann as a knight of the air, a romantic figure belonging to the lineage of the Red Baron. But to view him through the lens of chivalry is to misunderstand the brutal evolution of warfare in the 20th century. Hartmann was not a knight. He was the first modern aerial predator. He stripped the art of flying of its ego. While his contemporaries chased medals through reckless aerobatics, Hartmann chased efficiency. He understood before anyone else that in the age of high-performance machines, the pilot who survives is not the one with the steadiest hands, but the one with the coldest mind. His legacy is not found in the 352 kill marks on his tail, but in the ruthless algorithm of see, decide, attack, break. This doctrine of energy management and psychological discipline anticipated the future of air combat. The principles he forged over the burning steppes of Russia, striking from the blind spot, refusing the turning fight, and prioritizing survival over the kill, are the same principles taught to jet fighter pilots today. Erich Hartmann walked out of the cockpit in 1945, but the boy who panicked and ran out of fuel in 1942 never really left him. That fear was the fuel for his genius. It taught him that in the unforgiving mathematics of total war, there are no heroes. Only those who see the enemy first and those who never see anything again.